So without delay, I would like to restart this dialogue, Francis, with a question to you. Francis, how can digital transformation be leveraged to rebuild more inclusive, diverse, equitable economies in a post-COVID world? You are mute.
Well, first, thank you very much to invite me to be on this panel and to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the topic of digital transformation and inclusion. And I think all of us, the fact that we're on Zoom, it just speaks to how COVID has fundamentally changed how we think about technology, and that technology today is underpinning everything we do, from how we work, which is how we're connecting with each other right now, to how we learn, how we play, how we socialize. It is every single part of our being is being underpinned by technology. So with that in mind, it is more important than ever that inclusion is built into the technology infrastructure. So as you mentioned, my previous role at IBM as IBM's Chief Accessibility Officer, we actually and the organization is actually based in IBM research. So we looked out a horizon on where the technology is going. And we know that, as the technology moving from what I call the system-based optimization, meaning in the old days, the computer is there to really help automate, process, increase the efficiency or the speed of data processing, to today, computer or technologies in everybody's hand, in your palm, for example, in the form factor of an iPhone. So the transformation of the technology to be personalized or consumerized is a revolutionary change. And because of that, I think as governments and also especially telco companies, as they build out the next blueprint of infrastructure, of internet, including using new technologies such as 5G, it's so important that we think about inclusion, because this access is going to be fundamentally crucial. We do not want to build a society not only have divide from economic sense, from social status sense, but also from digital sense. So this is the time that we can come together, and that is absolutely important to not just think about this topic, but really take active action in that. And also, I think, as we think about digital transformation, a lot of time when we talk about inclusion, it's not unusual for people to have a kind of a reaction, especially the people in the technology world, to think that inclusion is for them, is for somebody in the HR human resources department. We technologists, we think about things that are technical. But the issue is that, like I mentioned, that technology underpins every individual's right to live, or right to be independent, and right to pursue happiness. We actually have to begin to think, how do we put human first in our thinking, especially in some of these infrastructure project, infrastructure backgrounds, such as the internet. And I think it also evolves that it's going to require all of us to think about this topic of internet transformation from a multi-stakeholder perspective, in that we really need to have the participants of people, for example, are either underserved based on economics, and also people who are underserved based on the ability. Now, being a Chief Accessibility Officer, my responsibility is to making sure that technology does not create barrier for people who are aging or disabilities. So this is another very important part, is that how do we reimagine the internet of the next era, that with inclusion, with ability, with age, with a cultural background, with a religion, and of course, race and sex, sexual orientation into the mix. And it can be done if we think proactively the last thing we want to do is to think about inclusion sequentially, think about race first, and then, gender, then and then sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. So this is actually one of the things that I hope that as we kind of move forward is to have a holistic and very proactive approach to think about inclusion as not a human resource topic, but as a human first, fundamental to the importance of delivering, using Dr. Jim Poisson's favorite quote, deliver the digital promise to all, not just to some.
Thank you, Francis. I couldn't agree more with you. And during our interview for our digital transformation dialogue series, we had the pleasure to explore that even further. So I invite our attendees who are online with us now to check Francis' interview. So John, back to you, John Garrett. I think there is a very important role for governments to play here, right? So how can governments support the idea of building forward better in a post-COVID world, taking into consideration all the issues that Francis also discussed? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Carolina, and good evening, everyone from out here in the Philippines. It's great to be with you all talking about this year's edition of the Network Readiness Index. And maybe before answering your question, I mean, I would just love to talk a little bit about the NRI. I mean, I think when I think about the NRI, it's something of a gold standard when it comes to country level indices that really measure digital transformation across the world. I mean, I think the fact that it's been around since 2002, and you have this continuity of the index is one that gives it a leg up over some of the other indices that have come out that are measuring digital transformation from international organizations, but it no longer exists. And there are, of course, a number of other indices that measure, for example, the Internet Inclusion Index or the Affordability Drivers Index that are more recent, and so don't have that history. I mean, if you indulge me a little bit, I remember the first time I interacted with the NRI was back in 2008 or so. I was at Cisco at the time in emerging market strategy and government affairs, and I remember one of the first times I heard about the NRI was because a country in Southeast Asia actually had its rankings as a goal, improving its rankings as a goal in its national policy. So immediately, we took notice and said, what is this NRI that's really driving country strategy? And today, I mean, you mentioned some of the history, but at USAID, when we were working on the whole aspect of the self-reliance indicators, the components of the NRI filtered into the ICT components there. So just to say, congratulations to the Portulans Institute team, and please keep it up, because the work that we're doing, whether it's in government or in the private sector or in donor agencies, we very much rely on the NRI. I guess the point about building forward better really is predicated on the fact that what we see in development and working in developing countries is that digital infrastructure and the deployment of digital infrastructure and digital countries with digital ecosystems have been able to sort of weather the external shock of coronavirus, in some cases a lot better than others, and continue and are able to continue to deliver on social development programs and outcomes. I mean, when the pandemic hit and we all, or many of us transitioned, many countries shut down and transitioned to an era of telework or distance education or e-health. And there were some countries that were better able and better equipped to do this. I mean, if you look at some of the data coming out of MIT on the US economy, before coronavirus, about 15% of the US labor force was teleworking. But at the height of the pandemic earlier in the year, that increased to about 50%. And you look at the numbers of coming out of the UN and UNESCO of around 1.5 billion students who were affected by the school shutdowns, and only 2/3 were able to participate in some meaningful way through distance education. It was those countries that had the digital infrastructure and the digital ecosystems in place that were better equipped. And if you specifically look at countries here in Asia, I mean, one of the things that we saw early on in the pandemic was that those countries that had a robust digital infrastructure and also had significant adoption of, for example, smartphone devices, those were the places that were better able to really implement robust contact tracing systems to really figure out how do you deal with this coronavirus threat. And countries like the Philippines, where there are mobile money payment systems, and you have an economy that really much relies on remittances, some of the impact of the virus, the coronavirus, on a country where there's a large informal sector, some of that was weathered a little bit better with the ability to make digital financial payments and mobile money payments. So, you know, we could go on for a long time, and I think it would be great to hear from some of the other panelists, but just to say that when it comes to being able to weather external shocks, when it comes to being able to continue to deliver on social development programming, it's really an imperative now to make sure that a country has a robust digital ecosystem, and that is guided really by the indicators and the work that's put out by your team and the NRI.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much for bringing up the NRI. We work hard to ensure that we provide a tool that countries can use, has an assessment tool, but also has a measurement of their development in their state. I hope you guys can hear me better. So I got some messages saying my microphone was not so good. So can you hear me better now? Okay, so moving forward, Jim Poisson, I would like to bring to you and add to the cycle, right? Add to this environment, adding the role of the private sector. You have been working with associations and groups and companies from the private sector, building this ecosystem that John mentioned. So what is the role of the private sector, especially the technology sector, in building forward better? Jean, you are on mute. Jean, you're on mute. No, Jean, you're still mute.
Sorry.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize for that. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you. I wanted to add to John's comment about the NRI report. It's another excellent review of the, around the globe in terms of the status of countries in terms of their ICT development. And it is WITS's gold standard in terms of, how we view progress in every country. And I want to take just a moment to talk about WITSA, just briefly. As Carol explained, we're a consortium of over 80 leading ICT associations around the globe, who represent about 90% of the ICT companies. So we're delighted to be in that kind of wheelhouse, watching and observing and experiencing this thing called the digital age and revolution. I do want to do a level set in terms of the term we bandy about now, as opposed to others that we've done in the past, is the digital transformation. And, in my opinion, digital transformation it depends on where you're sitting. In some countries, digital transformation is simply trying to get infrastructure set up to operate. In other countries, it's how to change the taxi cab industry with Uber. So we're talking about a vast array of definitions in terms of what does it mean, digital transformation. So I want to kind of set that, because depending on where you're sitting is where you stand on this term, digital transformation. Now, the question I was given was, okay, what's the role of the private sector? So if you bear with me, I'm going to read a script that I wrote because I don't want to miss anything. So when it comes to the future of national ICT development anywhere in the world, the role of the private sector is entwined within the role of the public sector. In that it's governments that decide the role of the private sector. It's governments that determine the technology they're going to use, and it's governments that determine what they purchase. Now, therefore, there's no standalone role for the private sector per se when it comes to ICT development. Now, you could argue that you can define points of that, but and overall, from a national perspective, it's the governments in cooperation with the private sector that lead the way. I want to talk about three different models in terms of ICT development. I want to start with the United States. It's the United States government that decides on what technology they wish to use within their department programs, such as defense, cybersecurity, public services. In turn, the public sector responds to the government via RFPs, and proposals are reviewed by the government, and then purchases are made. The private sector in the United States is kept at arm's length from government procurement procedures. So there's no there's no overall digital plan for the United States that I'm aware of. There is by departments there are plans. The second model is the public-private partnership model, where the governments literally partner with the private sector and share the risks and rewards. PPPs are typically of a long-term nature, and there may or may not be national plans around the PPPs. The third model is found in a number of the countries ranked high in the NRI index. These are the countries that have long-term digital agendas or plans. These are the countries that recognize that information and communications technology has become their main tool for raising the competitiveness in every economic sector and walk of life. Therefore, digital agendas become part of the national strategies. Now, finally, if asked which model I would recommend, I would say model number 3, where the national digital agendas, where the private sector is intricately involved in the country's national strategy, and where they are invested in the future success of the country and the quality of life in their nations. So that would be my kind of introductory response to your question about the role of the private sector in ICT development. Also, let me finish by not ignoring the pandemic. I may be in the minority of this, but I see the pandemic as coming and going, just like everything else in life. Everything has everything has its time, and everything passes its time. I think in a year from now, this conversation will be a lot different. However, the pandemic has caused an enormous impact on societies of which we will probably figure out in the next 5 or 10 years in terms of what it actually did. Now, Francis mentioned, being on Zoom today is part and parcel of that evolution. I would go take it a step further and say that I think this trend of people meeting online has been promulgated by the virus, but it was coming. I don't see in our business, as mentioned earlier, we have this major event called the World Congress on IT. The last time we did this in 2019 in Armenia, we had about 5,000 people. I don't expect to have 5,000 people ever again at our events. Why? Because if you look at the trends of people using this particular technology, the question you would have to ask yourself, if this is this good, that is, we could see each other, talk to each other, ask each other questions globally anytime we want, then you have to ask the question, if you're going to spend 18 hours on an airplane to go to a remote location across the globe, would you do that if you could view a speaker on Zoom? And so a lot of these questions are being answered now. They're being proven that's just not necessary. So that element alone of meetings and conferences is going to be dramatically changed. But again, is hopefully with the advances in technology, we will, in medicine, we're going to get over this pandemic, and then we're back to building up on that NRI. How do we get countries more engaged in developing digital transformation at the highest possible level? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. But I have to tell you, if you invite me for a conference in Bali, I will hop in the plane anytime.
You will? Okay. All right.
Okay, very good. So, Misako, thank you so much for joining us from UNESCO today. How do you see the state of digital transformation is benefiting people in Asia and the Pacific region? And how can we ensure those benefits actually are accessible to all?
Thank you, Carolina. And I also would like to join the previous speakers in congratulating the Portulans Institute for launching the NRI report, and also for partnering with UNESCO to organize this series of debate on digital transformation, which is very needed in the region. So I can see the state of digital transformations is benefiting people in Asia. As you know, the Asia-Pacific region is home to more than 4 billion people, and the number of active social media users account for over 40% of the total populations, and the majority of the users in the regions today are the young generations between the age of 18 and 34 years old. And there are also a number of Asian platforms such as Line, TikTok, WeChat, KakaoTalk, etc. That challenges the dominance of North American platform. And there are also areas of technical development, such as the e-payment that was mentioned before, the 5Gs, that are more advanced than in other parts of the world. And for example, if you look at the case of Thailand, internet can be accessed relatively cheaply with low-cost mobile phone, computers, line access, and internet access fees. So innovation is encouraged, finance is available, but there are still also a large number of populations in Asia-Pacific countries that have limited access to the internet. And the region is also challenged by other area of disadvantages, such as provision of access in minority languages for rural communities, women and girls, people with disabilities. And as Francis mentioned that before, with a rapidly aging population and rapidly advancing technologies, there is a clear accelerating digital divide that affects people over 50 years of age. And another trend that we can observe in the region is that there has been an increasing evidence of the loss of freedom of expression online, as digital technologies are more and more being used to block or filter online content, for online surveillance or online harassment. And as this was already mentioned several times by the speakers before, but the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated all these changes which are already underway in the digital world, such as the move of educations and health services online, the trend to e-commerce, the increase home-based online working, but it has also created challenges and increased existing inequalities. So to make sure that no one is left behind and the digital transformations can benefit all people, UNESCO basically promotes 4 key principles that are abbreviated as the Rome Principles. So R stands for human rights. We need a digital transformation that respects human rights. O stands for openness. We are promoting the adoptions of open standards to drive the innovation and the digital transformation. R stands for accessibility. So accessibility of the technology infrastructure, but also about the capacity of everyone to access to the benefit of digital transformations. And the M for multi-stakeholder participations. And UNESCO believes that those 4 principles are fundamental for the digital transformations to be inclusive and to be in line with the vision of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thank you.
Thank you, Misako. It's wonderful that you brought the RUAN. I remember doing a lot of the initial research that resulted on them, and it was an incredible, important step at the time that stakeholders were coming together for things like the Net Mundial. I think was such an important historical moment in internet governance in general to recognize we need to build things together to benefit all. So Bruno, I want to bring back to you. Sorry, Bruno, I want to bring the floor to you and do a follow-up on some of the comments we had so far. So how can countries leverage innovation and network readiness to strive for competitiveness in a post-COVID world, but also potentially preventing this digital divide that the previous panelists have mentioned?
Yes, thank you, Carolina. These are indeed the key questions, especially in Asia Pacific, where the demographic center of gravity of the planet is. We have indeed in Asia Pacific the 2 most populated countries on Earth, China and India, but also heavily populated countries that includes Indonesia, for instance, Thailand, and others. So when we talk about rebalancing the emphasis between technology and people, we have to consider that factor. When you have large population, you have to address a number of issues, including employment, job creation. You have to address the issues of inequalities within your own economies. You have to look at a number of dimensions which take a different scale, a different order of magnitude, just because of the size of population. It's clear that globalization has diminished inequality among countries. It has allowed a number of countries to move up in terms of average income and reduce this gap. But it has largely increased inequalities within national economies. And when you have large population, this translates into millions and sometimes more of people. So the issues of seeing how technology can help countries to move up the ladder of innovation, to move up the ladder of competitiveness, and as well of inclusion, of reducing inequalities, takes a different nature in Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific is also the region among the world where the inequalities among countries have remained the highest. You have some very advanced countries. The region includes OECD members. It includes Japan, it includes Singapore, but it also includes Bangladesh, it includes Myanmar. So the spread at which we have to look is very different in that part of the world from what we have elsewhere. So the short answer is yes, technology can make a big difference. Balancing the human factor and the technology factors is critically important, but looking at the specifics of demography, but also of culture within those countries will be critically important if we want to fully leverage the benefits of technology.
Thank you, Bruno, for that very balanced view. and I couldn't agree more with Asia being the center of gravity in terms of demography. I think a lot of the push for digital inclusion and digital transformation does come from that region. And we're going to discuss later in the NRI, we see some of the top countries in the NRI coming from that region. But it's incredible to see that a region has such a diverse of results, as we're going to discuss later with developed and developing countries. But we're going to arrive there soon in our second segment. So John, I want to come back to you, John Garrett, with what is the role of technology policy in all this process, right? We talked about the role of government, the role of private sector. What is the role of policy?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to circle back to a couple of the things that that was said by the previous panelists, particularly with Misako talking about the lingering issues of the digital divide and how sticky and pernicious it is, and how damaging it can be with regard to continuing income inequality. And then the point that Bruno made about technology really playing a role in helping to close gaps in income inequality between countries. This is driven by technology adoption by some very large economies like China and India, to some extent in Africa, but causing increasing income inequality within countries. And so, you know, from the work that we do in development, it's very clear now that a robust digital ecosystem is an absolute imperative when it comes to trying to address poverty alleviation, particularly through economic growth and social development. I think the conversation has shifted positively from a lot of our peers in different sectoral elements of development, whether you're in health or in education or in agriculture, thinking that, okay, digital infrastructure and a digital economy, that's a nice thing to have, but we're focused on, you know, these specific outcomes with regard to health indicators, et cetera. When really what we see, not just in times of COVID, but before, that a robust digital economy and robust digital infrastructure is actually more of a prerequisite to being able to more quickly and efficiently arrive at some of those social development outcomes. And so, you know, I think a number of organizations are concerned, a number of countries are concerned about the fact that digital divides contribute to increasing income inequality within countries, but you add this external shock of a coronavirus, and that's exacerbating the situation, because you take the example of students and you know, students in country X moving to distance learning. It's really only the students who have access to a robust digital infrastructure that can participate and continue to participate in learning outcomes. So, you know, policy plays a key role across all the different elements of a digital transformation strategy at a national level. And there's different frameworks that the different organizations use, but they really all pivot around the infrastructure layer, the skills and the awareness segment for individuals, around government leadership and modeling and embedding and implementing e-government services that can really accelerate the adoption of digital transformation, whether it's digital identity services or even just online transactions. And then, of course, the policy and infrastructure component that cuts across all these different elements that can help to accelerate the private sector's role in expanding infrastructure, that can really encourage individuals to participate in the digital economy. And maybe just to close, I mean, one example of this where we see the importance of technology policy is really around this notion of the network and the expansion of the network to try and reach some notional goal of universal internet access. I mean, in the first decade of this millennium, I think the belief among private sector, among governments, around development institutions was that because of the mobile miracle that we saw, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, with telecommunications companies really bringing on a number of people into mobile voice and and the adoption of cell phones, that the private sector was really going to push networks out into rural areas, and that was how we were going to get universal connectivity. But it's clear now, today, that the private sector has an interest to invest in areas where they will get sufficient return on their investment for their deployments. And so that's why we don't see universal internet access, particularly in rural areas, in areas where you have low population density, because there isn't that commercial return. So there's a very specific role for technology policy and government policy to find models of either one-time subsidy, recurring subsidy, or encouragement of the private sector moving out into some of those areas.
Thank you, John. And you actually makes me make me think about the concept of meaningful connectivity. That was something we discussed during the global launch of the NRI, and the Alliance for Affordable Internet. One of our partners work extensively on that. So thank you for bringing that up too. So moving forward, Francis, connected to the question I just discussed with John, what are the policies or best practices that you could share from your experience, especially in Asia?
So in the mid-90s, I was on an international assignment to Beijing, China, to help open up the financial services sector for IBM. And one of the projects was building out the China payment system, which is the Federal Reserve equivalent of interbank clearing and settlement system. And I remember back then, in the mid-90s, in the countries like the United States, we were laying cables for connectivity. And China back then knew that if they were going to build a technology infrastructure, laying the cable, copper cable or fiber optic is just going to be too time-consuming and too resource-intensive. So I remember accompanying some of my people, Bank of China, to Germany to look at satellite, communication. So this is just an example of how Asia Pacific, because they really don't have a legacy baggage, so to speak, of technology. In many cases, they can leapfrog, tremendously. So, fast forward to now. A year and a half ago, I was in Beijing, China, and talking about this digital inclusion topic. And I was walking down the street, and actually I saw a beggar. You don't see many beggars in China, but you do see one or two occasionally. And in this case, the beggar was asking people not to give him money, but he used the WePay. He wanted the money to be transacted, or the donation of the money to him through his cell phone. So this is a kind of progress a country like China has made in terms of making technology ubiquitous, to its citizen. Now, we still certainly have seen, interior China, there is, probably some discrepancies in terms of access. But in general, I think Asia Pacific has done a tremendous job in terms of leveraging technology to create better access. And of course, my area of kind of a focus or specialty is on digital inclusion or accessibility for people who are aging and with disabilities. And again, I look to historically, when you're dealing with a underserved population with people with disabilities, a lot of times are the NGO, non-government organization or nonprofit that come into play. And I'm always impressed by how the Asia Pacific NGOs, especially like Japan, you have Nippon Society, which is a very well-established NGO, but they actually had very early focus on technology. And as a matter of fact, they were one of the first one to really sponsor an accessible city strategy studies along with Microsoft and a few other companies. So the NGOs in Asia Pacific actually have the foresight to understand that a technology is going to impact the citizens' well-being and pursuit of happiness. So they actually took the step to lead the effort in making kind of technology a first and foremost topic. And then you also, back in the late 2000 or early 2010s, the Indian government, for example, was very focused on working with, at the time, IBM Research to come up with a technology, in this case called spoken web, meaning, you know, in India, a lot of population is still undereducated, so they don't really write very well, or the literature illiteracy is very high. So how do you make technology meaningful to them, to a farmer who wants to sell the crop but cannot type using text, you know, like you and I do? So, you know, they were looking to have solutions like using speech as the internet navigational interface. And but last but not the least, you have countries like Australia initiated a very almost revolutionary thinking on this national disability insurance scheme, NDIS, which is a way of redistributing support and the services to people with disabilities using technology. So instead of relying on a lot of social workers to provide services to the people with disabilities, the vision is that using technology to direct service, by using a very, in this case, they're actually using avatar, in today's language, a virtual reality kind of a setup to make the interface easier. So these are incredible, you know, forward-thinking examples that came out of the Asia Pacific region, because I think they actually have the freedom to imagine, because they don't have some of the historic baggage of a legacy to pull, you know, to kind of slow them down.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Francis. And Misako, back to you. UNESCO has been more and more active in the area, also supporting what is known as the digital cooperation work and the digital interoperability work. What is needed to ensure that no one is left behind and all can harness the benefits, and how UNESCO is contributing to that at this time, again, especially in Asia?
Yes, so just to follow up to what Francis has said, and as you know, UNESCO is the UN organization that is mandated to advance the sustainable development goals in the area of education, science, culture, and communication. So we support the digital transformation in those areas, and we are making sure that the 4 principles that I mentioned before, the Rome principles, guide our actions in the region. So for example, in terms of human rights, we believe that digital transformation must respect the human rights, such as the right to freedom of expression online, the right to privacy, to protect people from unnecessary surveillance, including for tracking the COVID-19 outbreak, and to keep the online environment as safe as possible for information sharing, education, and participation. And for example, we work to ensure that legislation and safeguards are in place to protect the safety of journalists and bloggers online, especially the women journalists who are often the target of online harassment and need to be aware of existing protection mechanism. In terms of openness, which is a very important principle that we are promoting, we advocate for a digital transformation that promote openness, whether it applies to open educational resources, open access to scientific research, open access to digitized cultural content, open source software, or open data. And we need to think about technology as a public good, like the internet. And for example, in the region, we are supporting galleries, libraries, museums, and archives to digitize their collections and make them accessible online through an open licensing framework. We are building the capacity of those institutions in adopting an open access policy to cultural content. We are also supporting the development of open source software community in Asia by linking the community with existing financial support, creating opportunities for more developers, especially the young generations, to engage in the communities. And in terms of accessibility, as you know, I mean, UNESCO is supporting the development of digital skills and competencies, which include the ability to critically evaluate the media content and create messages that we believe as essential to face the contemporary challenges of fake news, disinformation, hate speech in the digital world and in digital communications. And again, here we put a special emphasis on girls and women, as it is widely recognized as the gender imbalance still remains significant in the field of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because around 80% of people who work in those fields in the world are men. And for example, if you take the example of Thailand, the percentage of women in engineering field is only 22%. But the recent UNESCO study on digital skills among young students in the region found that the girls outperform boys in all domains of digital skills, but their confidence in those skills was lower. So we are working on strategy for girls and women to overcome social and psychological barriers, and we encourage more young women to pursue studies and careers in the field of science, technology, engineering, in mathematics. And to finish my presentation on the regarding the multi-stakeholder participations, UNESCO, of course, promotes a digital transformation that is driven through a multi-stakeholder participation, which means that all decisions that relate to the transformations of societies have to be taken in close consultation with the government, private sector, civil society, international organization, and end users, based on the model of Internet Governance Forum. And in the region, we are engaging, of course, in multi-stakeholder discussion when it comes to developing Internet policy, etc. So these are the examples that we are implementing in the regions to make sure that digital transformation can benefit all people in Asia.
Thank you, Misako. That was very insightful, and it's very interesting. I was in a meeting recently with the Ford Foundation, who is funding a lot of work now on how you ensure that the infrastructure is accessible to all. And one of the research results presented by a group actually studying some countries in Asia was that even if you go to conferences like software development conferences, you have less women present, right? And one of the tactics they were using to bring more women was actually to set mentorships schemes. So the more you have mentorships and even men supporting women being part of those communities, the more confident they are. So it's very interesting to see a lot of data trying to understand exactly even the psychological issues of involving women in ICT. So thank you so much for bringing that, and thank you for the work of UNESCO regarding to that. So without delay now, I would like to move us all to the second segment of our event today. I want to acknowledge it that we have some Q&A questions, but I would like to move forward and bring those Q&A, those questions back at the end of the second segment. So Bruno, I would like to invite you to the floor to share with us the highlights of the NRI for Asia. And after that, I would love to have all the panelists coming back to comment on those results. So I will bring the word back to you, Bruno.
Okay, thank you, Carolina. Let me just preface the presentation I'm going to make now by a word of caution. I am an economist by training. As John knows very well, we keep hearing at least two definitions of economists. One is that an economist is just an accountant without the sex appeal. The other one is that the economist is the person who will be ready tomorrow why they were wrong yesterday. In NRI, we do things differently. That is, NRI is not a snapshot. It is not about naming and shaming. It is about being a tool for action. So we are definitely looking at the future. We are trying to equip national economies to better prepare for the challenges of tomorrow and leverage digital transformation in doing so. So I was very happy to hear the nice words from the panelists about NRI being the gold standard and being used by an increasing number of countries to guide their own strategies and performance. That's something that scared us a little in the initial years of the NRI in 2003, 2004, but we have become accustomed to, and we try to be up to our reputation now. So let me try and share my screen. You should see the first slide of the presentation appearing now. Is that okay for everybody?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So as you heard, the theme of the report this year is accelerating digital transformation in a post-COVID global economy. And that leads us to actually looking at what NRI is. So NRI is an index, but I will say a few words about its architecture and its purpose. Then I will spend some time looking at the rankings of this year, then explaining how we tackled the issue of digital transformation in the report, and spend detailed times on articulating the key messages emanating from this year's report. All of that should not take more than 20 minutes, and stop me if I'm over doing it. So NRI. NRI clearly is about technology. It's mostly about communication and information technology, ICTs, but it is first and foremost an index and a model that offer a human-centric approach to ICTs. So that goes very much along the comments we heard from the panelists, in particular Francis, saying we need to be human-centric. This is where the end result should be of technology. Does it improve the lives of people, including from reducing inequalities, increasing inclusiveness, inclusive happiness, as we call it. The key metrics that we propose are the core of ICTs, and they are aiming at measuring and benchmarking the ways in which different national economies can benefit from ICTs. The basic fundamental message is very clear. You cannot improve what you cannot measure. The second aspect worth keeping in mind is that this is now a 20-year-old index. So we benefit not only for respectable time series that we analyze continuously, but also from the continuous feedback of those governments, those companies, those organizations who have been using NRI as a point of reference and as a tool for action. The NRI was redesigned in 2019 when the governance moved from the World Economic Forum to the Portulans Institute. And we took that opportunity to make it truly about future readiness and about rebalancing technology on one hand and human aspects on the other hand. And last but not least, we were very privileged to have WITSA as our partner last year. This year, we have STL, an industry-leading provider of digital solutions. That's for the background of the index. The model itself, as I mentioned before, is aiming at balancing technology on one hand and human aspects on the other hand. To do that, we, as economists, put together a model which is based on 4 pillars: technology, people, governance, impact. Themselves have each of them 3 sub-pillars, and altogether that boils down to 60 indicators. So it's a fairly complex and holistic approach that we have to benchmarking NRI performance. So that leads us to rankings. And what are the rankings in 2020? 134 economies covered. The top 3 are Sweden, Denmark, and Singapore. So we already have an Asian country in the top 3. And if you look at the rest of the top 10, Netherlands, Switzerland, Finland, Norway, United States, Germany, United Kingdom, a first striking reality is that we only have countries with high levels of GDP per capita. Already we have a message about digital divides that we mentioned before. In the holistic way we measure digital readiness to use networks, to leverage technological opportunities, rich countries have an additional advantage. So a possible consequence is that digital transformation may increase inequalities rather than reducing them. So we need to look at this a little more deeply. And this is what we do when we try to project, for instance, the comparisons or correlation between network readiness. The NRI performance is represented on the vertical axis of this diagram to income per capita. So the wealth of countries is represented on the horizontal axis. In other words, the higher you go on this diagram, the higher NRI performance. And the farther you go to the right, the wealthier the countries. And what we see from a diagram like this is that we have a clear distinction between income groups. If we take the World Bank definition of what is a high income country, a high, lower, middle income country, or low income country, and these are represented by the various colors, we see that we have a strong grouping of the rich countries at the higher levels of NRI, followed by middle income countries, then by the lower middle income, and then by the low income. So the regression line, the black line you see, is just a translation of that. Yet, there are differences worth appreciating. One of them, and that's particularly important for Asia and the Pacific, is that a number of countries are actually boxing above their weight. In other words, their NRI performance is better than what their GDP per capita would suggest or indicate. And 2 of the countries for which this is true are the 2 most heavily populated countries on Earth. They are the big blue bubble you see towards the middle of the diagram, that is India, and the big orange bubble, also towards the middle, that is China. And both India and China are above the regression line. That is, they are doing better than what their GDP per capita would suggest, which means 2 things. It means something that John Garrity mentioned earlier: policies matter. These countries are among the countries that have adopted policies and strategies that grant priority to developing the infrastructure, to granting access to a majority of the population to the benefits of e-government, e-business, and digital technologies generally. And it also shows that it is feasible. If we compare that kind of diagram to what we have, let's say, for innovation, we see that countries like Vietnam or Philippines are doing very well and moving up the ladder. We see that Korea was a country that in 1964 had the same GDP per capita as Ghana. What happened between 64 and now, between Korea and Ghana, is that Korea set up a deliberate policy combining two elements: one, education, two, broadband. And we see the results now. So Asia Pacific shows the way in which middle-income countries in general, and that's the majority of the Earth's population, could move up the ladder of digital transformation. When we have these rankings, we try to also go a little deeper. We look at how various pillars are hierarchized. In other words, how different countries, etc., show up. And if you take the four pillars, you see that the rich countries, especially in Western Europe and North America, are performing higher than others, are pillars 1 and 3, typically technology and governance. If you look at the other two, people and impact, you see Asia already in prominent positions. Korea is number 2 for the way in which population is involved in digital transformation, and Singapore is number 1 in the world in terms of impact. So we already have critical, visible positions that are the case for Asian and Asia Pacific countries in NRI. If we look at income groups, we have similar signals. Clearly, high-income countries continue to dominate the rankings, as mentioned before, but in each group, there are champions. And if you take the upper middle-income countries, which is the most dynamic group, there where we identify the champions of tomorrow, you have countries like Malaysia at 34, China at 40, which are leading the pack. And they are Asian countries and quite heavily populated. Malaysia is one of these heavily populated countries that had to develop digital transformation on a broad scale, which is a different challenge than what we have in, let's say, Sweden or Switzerland. If you go to lower middle income countries, you have Vietnam leading the pack. And these two categories of upper middle income countries and lower middle income countries are again carrying the day. They are the ones where we will see where the real impact of digital transformation is at the world level. So Asia is indeed the symbol and also leader of what's happening for the majority of world population. If we look at the regions, of course, that translates in different ways. That is, we see Africa being disconnected. And that's increasingly the case. It relates to poverty strategies, poverty alleviation strategies, as mentioned by John earlier. It also relates to other factors, that is the indirect consequences of COVID in terms of trade, in terms of investment. But if we look at the specific case of Asia Pacific, we see that if we look a little beyond the leaders, beyond Singapore, Australia, and Korea, actually we have one of the largest variations in terms of country performance. If we went back to the bubble chart, which I will not do for the sake of time, we would see indeed that the spread among Asia Pacific countries is bigger than whatever we have in other parts of the world. So this idea where regional cooperation comes in, where the role of regional development banks comes in, all of that needs to be considered as specific to the Asia Pacific region. So altogether, and focusing on the region, and we translate that into spread data, the dispersion of scores is high. Altogether, 21 economies from Asia Pacific are included in the rankings this year. There are very few for which we don't have the data. the statistical apparatus in Asia Pacific is generally sophisticated and of good quality. The distribution of income is also particular because it's a region where we have both fairly rich economies, some OECD members, as I mentioned, and at the same time, lower middle income economies, and that translates into the spread. So this heterogeneity of the region, and we said Singapore third, Nepal 113th, is something worth looking into. Just to finish with what is specific to NRI data for Asia and the Pacific, as mentioned before, strengths are in governance and impact. Technology and people, although we have some Asia Pacific countries ranking fairly high in terms of people, need to be looked into. The development of infrastructure is still key. Just to take one example, 93% of the people in India who access the internet do that through their phones. This is also an indication of where other types of infrastructure, especially regarding broadband, would need to be developed. So still work to be done, but very specific heterogeneity degree in Asia Pacific that makes it probably more challenging than in many other parts of the world. So what about digital transformation? Very quickly to focus on the report, because I feel that our discussion may lead us back into it. As Carolina mentioned, we carried out a series of interviews, which I encourage you to explore on our website. High-level people from public and private sector have shared with us their views of where the main challenges were, and you see some of their quotes there. There are many more on that site. So we have this dual product. We have the NRI report and we have the digital transformation series, which you can find on the Portulan website. The key question we asked in the report and in these interviews are the following. How is digital transformation impacting global inequality? And we have discussed that already quite a bit in the first part of this event. Second question, is digital transformation leading to better lives? Francis used the word happiness. 20 years ago, happiness was seen almost as a gimmick, a cheesy concept. And Bhutan, which had incorporated happiness in its measure of what is real GDP, was seen as, you know, an interesting curiosity. But again, Asia, the Asia Pacific region had open new thinking, had been ahead of thinking, because this idea of looking at better lives, how do we define happiness, was indeed spearheaded in the Asia Pacific region. And last question, are we controlling or being controlled by technology? This is largely a governance issue, but it is one that is raised more and more as the spread of social networks and other ambiguous tools is reaching large part of our populations. So again, the whole issue of rebalancing technology and human aspects is at the core of the way we look at Portulan at digital transformation, which leads me to the key messages. And I tried to mention them briefly and explain what we have in mind. The key messages, and again, all of those are trying to be geared to action. Digital transformation needs to be system-wide. What does it mean? It means that if we look at the performance of the champions of NRI, let's take Sweden, which is number one this year. Sweden is not number one in any of the 4 pillars of NRI, but Sweden has a very even and high-level performance in all the pillars. In other words, a good policy is a policy that looks at all aspects of digital transformation, all 4 pillars of the NRI model. It's not enough to develop a good high-performance broadband infrastructure if you're not making sure at the same time that the prices are such that it's affordable for the majority of the population. If you're not ensuring that it's not just e-commerce that is benefiting, but also education, also access to public services, including health. All of those means system-wide. You have to look at the whole gamut of tools in which digital transformation needs to be stimulated and pursued. Key message number 2, which again has been discussed quite a bit in the first part of our discussion, is digital transformation may create new forms of digital divide. It may widen some of the digital divides we've been familiar with in terms of access to internet, in terms of usage of equipment, but it may also create new forms of digital divide that had not been defined as such before. COVID new practices in terms of who is able to do teleworking, who is required to be on their working spots, so to speak. This has created new definitions of inequalities. When you push population to be confined for extended periods of time, you know, the fact that you have a family with 4 or 5 kids in a 3-room apartment makes a big difference compared to having access to a garden or some kind of open space. And those dimensions have become more visible than they were in the past. Third key message, trust and security are central to successful digital transformation. These are among the variables that we introduced or to which we gave more visibility in the new NRI model in 2019. Cybersecurity is becoming critical to expanding the use of digital to commerce, to education, to health, to all kinds of areas where digital transformation could play a role. But that became very clear with COVID, when more people moved to distance connection and use of digital in many areas. You know, security has to be enhanced. People have to be feeling confident that when they move from the physical world to which they may have been accustomed, they find the same level of trust, security, confidentiality in the digital world. The steps taken in Europe with GDPR are worth looking into, and adapting the realities of GDPR to other contexts, because the cultural dimension is critically important, is something which is a matter of priority today. Number 4, and again, this has been discussed already today, clearly the COVID crisis has been accelerated digital transformation. Not so much by pushing more people to use the technology, but also showing to all of us that we could do it, that something that were described as not possible, not feasible, not efficient, have become feasible and efficient and sometimes enjoyable. So this will not disappear as we get over the health crisis. These habits are going to stay, and they're going to keep accelerating digital transformation. Message number 5, education and reskilling are critically important for not only the success, but the sustainability of digital transformation. So we have already heard very clear signals, in particular from UNESCO, who has key responsibilities in that area, that education is not anymore this period of life during which you acquire skills and then you move to active life. Education is now a lifelong process. Online learning is going to become an increasing part of that. And that will be not only an engine, but also a result of digital transformation. Message number 6, digital transformation can help the accelerated implementation of SDGs. And SDGs are not just about fighting climate change. They are about reducing inequality, reducing poverty. They're about gender balance in all economic activities. There are many dimensions to SDGs. All of them can benefit from digital transformation. We have now a body of evidence that ICTs can help in each and every one of these areas. So we need to fully leverage that. And last but not least, key message number 4, digital transformation can help rebuild global cooperation and redefine globalization. What we've seen since the beginning of the COVID crisis has been retrenchment by national economies. We've seen a collapse of multilateral disciplines and a failure of collaboration that had existed for a long time. This can be very damageable to innovation, damageable to just the level of wealth that is being created at the planetary level, and it can be damageable to our ability to face future global challenges, not just health challenges, but challenges of moving up in an inclusive way. We need to rebuild trust. We need to rebuild the degree of cooperation that has existed between governments, between firms, private firms, between universities. This is critically important and has been, again, the victim of nationalistic policies over the last few months. Digital transformation is one of the ways in which we can show the world all together, each and every one of us, that moving beyond nation states, cooperating across borders can make digital transformation a true instrument to redefine globalization along the lines of a positive future for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno, so much.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Perfect, there you go. Okay, so I hope you can hear me well. Thank you so much for the presentation and for the regional highlights. I would love to bring back our panelists to hear some of their reactions. So, John, Garrett, if I may bring the word to you, I have 2 questions I would love to hear from the panelists. So what can we learn from these regional leaders that Bruno commented on? And what are your predictions regarding how COVID might impact the index in the next few years, right? It's data takes a while to be gathered and processed and collected, right? So how do you think the index will change with time?
Yeah, thanks, Carolina. Thanks, Bruno, for that excellent summary of this year's NRI results. I think maybe what I'd love to stress on is the point that Bruno made on the imperative of sort of system-wide transformation, and that's a great example from Sweden. I didn't know that they don't rank #1 in any one of the 4 main pillars, and so the point I think that I'd like to make and stress there and tie it back to regional leaders is the imperative and the importance of national leadership to drive that system-wide transformation. And there's a couple of reasons why I think an emphasis on national leadership to drive digital transformation is essential. And one of them is even just the nature of the index, right? The nature of an index like the NRI is such that even if you are progressing, if you're making absolute progress on any one of the metrics, because you're being compared to your regional neighbors in other countries, if your neighbors or your sort of per capita income peers are progressing more than you, you will fall behind in the index. So it's a little bit of a paradox. You're making progress, but you're still falling behind in the comparison. So it speaks to the need for national leadership across the different pillars. And as an example of national leadership, today was a very big day for webinars here in the region. We had it was a very big Asia Development Bank virtual conference like the one that Jim was talking about with his organization, where the conference was opened by the president of the Asian Development Bank and was followed by the Minister of Finance from Indonesia, Sri Mulyani Indrawat. And both of those presentations at the beginning of this full day conference really it was basically about digital solutions for for transformation and development, particularly in the COVID area. Both the president of the ADB and the Minister of Finance from Indonesia stressed above all the need to really build out robust digital infrastructure that you can build upon to drive economic growth. And Indonesia, I think, is a really interesting example because as you all know, I mean, it's the 4th most populous country in the world. It's a country that's spread out across 17,000 islands. And so national leadership and system-wide focus is a utmost imperative to really try and drive change in Indonesia. And I think we're seeing that particularly with the work that the government is doing around digital infrastructure. You know, they have a number of different programs that are doing it. And interestingly enough, at the same time as this ADB conference, there was also another webinar in the middle of the day that was headed up by the head of BAKTI, which is the Badan Aksesibilitas Telekomunikasi dan Informasi Agency. So it's the Universal Access Agency of Indonesia and Facebook. And they were basically talking about all of the infrastructure activities that they're doing, undersea cables, terrestrial cables, satellite launch that the government is sponsoring. So it's really this national push to support digital transformation. And you know what was shared in the ADB was even something like the coronavirus pandemic impacting the country within a 4-month. What was this? Within a 4-week period, the government authorized something on the order of mobile data distributed, mobile data amounts, allocations distributed to 40 million people across the country so that they would be able to access internet services over a 4-month period. So they did it, they mobilized in 4 weeks to provide 40 million people with 4 months of data. And so that's, I think, a great example of national leadership in the region. It's something to highlight.
If I may piggyback on this, Carolina?
Of course.
Because I think John mentioned some very important point. Regarding leadership, we know that in the Western European countries, North America, recovery packages are going to play a critically important role in terms of taking us out beyond COVID. And if you look at the European recovery package, it is massive, 750 billion euros. And the two axes are green and digital. Okay? So it goes exactly along the lines that John was describing for the ADB. Digital is becoming the backbone of efforts to help us think beyond COVID. The second, related to that, I just want to mention 2 figures about India and China. In India, in the next 5 years, 500 million people will gain access to the internet. Okay? Imagine that's almost twice the total population of the EU moving to the internet. So it's no surprise that all the big companies, you know, the Google, the GAFAs of this world are moving to India massively. And that has been accelerated by COVID. And the second, we can put that in comparison with projections of growth for Asia Pacific. Last year, the annual growth for China was 6.1%. This year, which is a crisis year, looking at the first 9 months, the annual growth projection for China is 4.9%. It is negative for practically all of the industrial world. So the conclusion is very simple. Whether it is driven by what we are going to see in India, or just driven by growth figures, the locomotive of the world economy is going to be Asia Pacific. That is very, very clear. So digital transformation in Asia Pacific will be the key to world digital transformation. That is very, very clear, not just from NRI data, but from the data available globally.
Thank you, Bruno. for those clarifications and additions. Jim, if I may come back to you. So what are your learnings, especially regarding the regional leaders, and how do you think COVID will impact the index moving forward?
Thank you, Carol. I was delighted to see, Bruno, your number one. I'm not sure you prioritize these, but I would think it's prioritized in my world, and that is number one key message is for digital transformation to be system-wide. Let me share some experiences with you, and I think what I'm about to say is very, very important. I've had the opportunity to travel around the world, in many cases, meet with the heads of state, and I pretty much insist on trying to do that so that I could understand the mentality of the leadership within each country that I go to. Where I find success, or the most success, is to add the, instead of leadership, I use the word champions. And where I see champions, that is people who step out above the fray of the political expectations or practice, and they are championing the digital progress of their countries. So that's what I see the number one ingredient. That is, someone or some group of people say, okay, time out. We may not be technologists. We don't know much about this thing called the digital age, but we do know it is good for our country. Let's get on the bandwagon. Let's gather what we need to do in terms of resources, and let's move forward to get our country into the digital age. Number one. Number two, you asked the question about policies. Policies are the net result of attitudes and cultures and laws and so on. That's what they are. So when you look at a policy, what you're basically looking at is the attitude of the particular country or the government. So I have been for years, when I do meet with these government officials, I basically, I wouldn't say plead is the wrong word, but really encourage them to look at other countries and their national plans. I use Korea as an example. I use Estonia as another example. Taiwan as another example. I say, look at these plans. They're available to you. And let me stop a minute and talk a little bit about the Korean plan. One of the things I was most impressed about is in the Korean plan, it's long-term. It also is protected from change. So my understanding is they passed a constitutional amendment to ensure that that plan is not touched by new regimes coming in, because it needs to be consistent. It needs to be left alone to grow and to do the things it's supposed to do. And also in these plans, in the Korean plan, every, I think, 18 months, they take the plan out, they put it on the table, and they say, okay, what's changed in the last 18 months that we need to now change our plan to make sure that we're going on the right path. An example of that would be when social media hit a few years ago. I mean, very strong. What impact does that have on your plan? Obviously, it's going to impact your elections. It's going to impact your information, your communications. All of that is going to get impacted. So where I see success is where there's a champion that is behind a comprehensive, long-term, untouchable plan that can be adjusted based on changes. And that is where you see, where you look around and you see that's the most effective way to move up the rankings. In terms of COVID, Carol, I must admit, I don't know what impact this is going to have. We can see it in front of our eyes in terms of the technology, the changes, the trends that are going on. But I don't know what, how that's going to impact digital development. and transformation. I don't have my sense is it's going to be, it's going away in a few years, and we'll be back to try to get back to normal. But these things we're seeing now will stay with us in terms of communications, meetings, and the like. So that would be my take.
Thank you so much, Jim. And yes, it's going to be interesting to see, because one of the things I see, especially here in the US, I'm originally from Brazil, and I'm following a lot what's happening in Brazil and the US. And you see a lot of a huge push both by the private sector, even through donations, and the government to, for example, give computers to the kids so they can take classes from home, right? Improve the broadband in certain areas. And even a lot of stores are opening up their wireless. So it's incredible to see kids sitting around a Taco Bell parking lot, right? Trying to take their classes. So it's interesting to see if those efforts will stop when COVID, right, is better, or if we actually gonna keep those folks connected and see a good connectivity. So let's hope for better and more holistic public policies, like John was mentioning before. So Francis, I wanna come back to you for your reactions, and then we can have final thoughts.
Sorry, I'm muted again. This is really a great way of summarizing, what we're facing, and also what are some of the opportunities that really the Asia Pacific region offer to us. I totally agree that in order for a digital transformation to really take hold in a sustainable way, that has to be a system-wide kind of a commitment and then also endorsement. I also see that the private sector should and could play a lot more role in this, because a lot of technology are being innovated by the private sectors. And I am an eternal optimist, and I think with the UN's, a sustainable development goal, kind of in the past, a lot of times the private sector viewed those as almost too lofty an idea. But as time goes on, you can see a transformation of some of the private sector leaders to move from, for example, shareholder only focus to what they now call stakeholder focus, right? I mean, last year, the Business Roundtable, which is one of the elitist CEO kind of a consortium led by Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase, and came out and said, the responsibility of a corporation is not just to the shareholder, but to the stakeholder. So with that as a backdrop, I think you're going to see the businesses really beginning to pivot, and some of that, frankly, is the pressure from people, right? The millennials, the new generation coming in, are a lot more socially conscious, and I can speak to the just on the disability side, perhaps because we mainstreamed children with disabilities participation in the schools system in the United States. And so the new generation coming in are a lot more comfortable in thinking inclusively, including people with disability or student with disability in their midst. So they're demanding a company or a sector, or even government in this case, to be a lot more inclusive. So from that standpoint, I think there is a huge opportunity for the government to team up with the private sectors, especially in the technology area, and to undertake some of these big digital transformation initiatives. And I think this is actually much needed for the technology company, because for them to be exposed to what I call the base of the pyramid issues, it's very humbling. And once they get exposed to it, I really believe that it will transform their attitude and their thinking, and their lead to creativity of coming up with solutions. And I go back to, again, I'm like I said, I'm a career IBMer. When IBM in the early days, when it started out, and the growth actually came out of are working on government projects, such as building the social security system, such as, creating the Apollo 13, the moon, the technology supporting us going to the moon. So these are bigger societal topics that I think the private sector can really partake if we can set up the right business model for the public-private partnership. And last example I want to say, Jim mentioned Taiwan. I just came back from 6 weeks visit to Taiwan due to a family illness emergency. I can tell you, the minute I arrived at the Taiwan airport, the contact tracing, the entire system of a COVID-19 management was done through electronics, including paying back. I'm waiting for my check to come through the digital payment for paying for my 14-day quarantine in the hotel. Everything is transacted through the digital platform. So it's doable, it's possible, and I think there's a lot of learning to be had through this COVID-19 phenomenon. And it's just like Bruno said, it really helped accelerate digital transformation, not just for the rich economies or big companies. I think it's lifting all boats. I think all countries, all business, large or small, has to think about digital inclusion as a must do.
Thank you, Francis. So I just want to thank you and appreciate you all so far. And Misako, let's start. I would love to invite you for our round of final thoughts. I want to give 1 minute to all of you. And just to acknowledge, one of the questions from the Q&A is how community-driven networks also play a role in all of this. So if I may also pose that question and move forward to final thoughts. Thank you, Misako.
So just, I want to come back to the presentations that Bruno has made, which was excellent. And I agree with all the messages that were put in the conclusion, especially the point on the need to building confidence and trust, which should be at the heart of digital transformation, but also to review the digital cooperation. And this is one of the key topics that of the UN Secretary General's report that was issued in July this year on the roadmap for digital cooperations. And this is one of the 8 areas of actions that he's proposing to the international community to take forward. But as we are talking about the Asia-Pacific regions, if I come back to the point that I want to make for the future of our regions, and we recognize that the region is doing quite well and advanced in terms of innovation, NRI, accessibility, capacity. But clearly, there is a worrying trend in terms of violation of international human rights laws when it comes to the use of technologies. And I think it's really important that we place the human right at the centers of regulatory framework, policies, and the use of technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Misako. And I'm just gonna go in order of who I see here in my screen. So Jim, could you share your final thoughts? You're mute.
Thank you. From my perspective, in terms of WITSA, our vision, I think Francis might have mentioned a little bit earlier, and that is fulfilling the promise of the digital age. What does that mean to us? It means that there is a great promise that's being held in front of us to connect everyone on Earth that wishes to be connected and to have everybody benefit from ICT. We know that the promise is out there. However, there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. We got half the world's population is not connected. Who knows, we'll get another billion, and what happens to the other 2 or 3 billion? We don't know that. But I think it's incumbent upon everyone everyone within the stakeholders and the shareholders here to understand that this thing is not guaranteed. And what we must do is to work together to make it happen. My plea or my request to countries that are lagging behind, it's obviously not too late. There's a lot of leapfrogging you can do. Remember that ICT is for the most part beneficial to people. It helps everyone's lives get better. Yes, there are challenges. We'll face those challenges, but don't lose sight of the big picture here. For those of you who are in government, those of you who are in industry, please encourage people to be champions, to get moving up the scale in terms of the NRI index for the good of your society, for the good of your people, for the good of your children. So that would be how I would like to end it. I think we're not done. We're far from done. This thing, there's no guarantee it's going to happen. Let's not leave 1 billion people. Let's not even leave one person behind when we have the opportunity to fulfill this promise.
Thank you, Jim. John?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to participate. This has been fantastic, and I've learned a lot from each of you. A couple of things, maybe to respond to the question that came in around community networks. It's a very sort of inside baseball when it comes to different options in the telecommunications deployment and value chain. But yes, I like community networks. I think are going to be something that can really play a role when it comes to trying to get to universal connectivity. We've seen here in the Philippines some interesting community network deployments, and in fact, what I think is the first randomized control trial when it comes to telecommunications, because of some work with community networks and deploying 2G and SMS. I promise I did not ask that question. So I did not ask the community networks question. I just want to go back maybe to the predictions. I purposely did not jump in on the predictions thing, but I should. So I would say maybe if you look at the NRI in 2023 or 2025, a couple of things. One, I would suspect that if you're looking at Bruno's chart where you see the relationship between NRI and GDP per capita, I would expect to see some countries fall back in terms of their country groupings, right? I mean, I think countries that are on the threshold, moving up from lower middle income to middle income, for example, may fall back because of coronavirus. But maybe more interestingly, I would be interested to see if we see more mixing of the countries and their NRI because of maybe some countries who are performing better on certain indicators that are more closely associated with a COVID response and recovery, maybe around digital health or something like that. So it would be really interesting to see if we see more mixing of the countries per GDP per capita grouping in a few years' time. In terms of a final thought, maybe something we've stressed throughout this conversation, and the fact that a focus on digital infrastructure and the digital ecosystem is not something that can only be the sort of luxury of higher per capita income countries. I think it's very clear now, more so than ever, that all countries, particularly low-income countries, lower middle income, landlocked countries, small island states, it's these countries that really have to focus on improving their digital environment and their digital ecosystem. And the NRI shows perfectly that even if you're improving, but only improving slowly, you're still falling behind. And so it's important to be monitoring that and employ this national leadership and system-wide focus. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
No, thank you, John. It's always a pleasure, and I also always learn so much from you. So let me go with Frances for her last thoughts, and then we can conclude with Bruno. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. Go ahead.
Well, thank you again for this opportunity, and especially calling out digital inclusion as we talked about the internet, infrastructure growth and all that. I think the opportunity, especially Asia Pacific, like Bruno said, this is one of the most heterogeneous, region in the world, and with a very widespread of best practices from Singapore to some of the lower income, but then potentially could be fast leapfrogging countries. So we have an opportunity, a experiment of social experiment in the Asia Pacific region that we can be had. And I also would say that I feel so strongly, because I'm a technologist first and foremost, and that the inclusion has to be, as we build the infrastructure, to build in at the foundational level. I mean, I feel so strongly about it. Carolina, you know that I wrote a book called Authentic Inclusion Drives Disruptive Innovation. And one of the key points that I try to highlight in my book is that first we have to think human first. So the fact that the NRI, the kind of your index includes, people, a human is absolutely crucial. And then the second thing is we have to be able to operationalize it, right? I mean, there's enough analysis and to talk about the issues, but how do we operationalize it through the government governance, policies, operating plans? And that, I think, is, I will love to see some more action by the government to take it down to the implementation level. And I think it's a panel like this, and this kind of and also the research that Portulans Institute done in putting the technology and people in the foreground and measuring the impact and in terms of the governance, that really can help to put the right focus on this digital transformation journey that we are all on. So again, thank you very much for inviting me today.
Thank you, Frances. And Bruno, may I give you the final word here? Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. So let me first thank you, Carolina, our moderator, and all of our panelists. Very exciting discussions, and like John, I consider a day during which you have not learned anything is a lost day. So today is definitely not a lost day. So thank you all. Just very quickly on the question that was asked about community networks, I think that goes along the line of key message number 8. What are the new players that can help us get across borders? We need to compare the experiences at local level. We need to provide people with a tool to do that. One type of player we have not mentioned in our discussion today is cities. Smart cities in particular are the natural test bed for artificial intelligence. Many of the experiments will be carried out in the years to come at city level, much more than at national level. So we're going to learn a lot from what happens at the local level, and we must encourage international cooperation in that area. Regarding the overall exercise of what is NRI about, I would like to echo the very important message that Jim Poisson articulated earlier. We are in this for the long term. We said that digital transformation is being accelerated. It's true. That does not mean that the results of digital transformation should be seen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. This may take years, it may take a generation, and we need a continuous commitment by governments and by others to continue the effort towards digital transformation. So if we look at the future, this is about younger generation. We need to involve younger generations in helping us shape what that digital future is going to be. I'm struck by the surveys we see, let's say, in Western Europe compared to what we see in Asia Pacific. If you ask people a very simple question, do you think that tomorrow will be better than today, or that the children of today are going to have a better life than their parents? The percentage is close to 80% in China. 80% believe that tomorrow will be better than today. And all over Asia Pacific, it is a high majority. If you look at the same figures in countries like France, it is between 30 and 40%, which means that 60% of younger generation in particular believe that tomorrow will not be as good as today or yesterday. This is dramatic because it's not the case. Those of us who are involved in digital transformation see huge opportunities to make these lives better. So we have to restore faith in the future. We have to restore enthusiasm. And I will finish with that. We have heard two key concepts today about digital dividends, about digital imperatives. I would like to bring in the concept of digital new frontier. This is a source of hope, it's a source of optimism, and it's a source of energy. So let's work with younger generation to make this global digital future a better place.
Thank you, Bruno, so much. And I want to again thank all our panelists, and I also want to thank all the attendants that have joined us today in various time zones of the world. And for now, I end our event. The video of this event and summary will be available at portulansinstitute.org in the next couple of days. Thank you, and if I may ask the panelists just to stay 1 second for an additional picture. Thank you, everybody. Okay, smile. Thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
All right. Good night.
Thank you, Jimmy, Carolina, for waking up so early in particular. Thank you all.